There was a time when the name Ascent Infinite Realm, AIR, stirred genuine excitement across the MMO community. Developed by Bluehole Studio, the very same team behind Terra, this ambitious project was introduced with a soaring vision. Shortly after its reveal, the game was rebranded as Elyon, a name that would come to represent both its bold promise and, eventually, its complex journey. From that point on, Elyon became the name etched into hopeful forums and whispered through trailers, standing as a symbol of innovation wrapped in a steampunk fantasy world. Elyon wasn't just trying to be another fantasy MMO in a crowded field, it was aiming to be something transformative. Its world was steeped in skyfaring technology, arcane magic, and large-scale battles waged not just on the ground, but in the heavens above. The concept of aerial warfare, personalized airships, and player-driven sky combat was unlike anything mainstream MMOs had fully embraced. It promised spectacle with substance, steampunk mech suits, clashing in explosive duels, while battleships exchanged cannon fire among the clouds. Backed by the pedigree of Terra, expectations were sky-high. Players hoped for the same fast, fluid combat, but now elevated with new dimensions, literally. With Bluehole's reputation for delivering tactile, satisfying gameplay and lush world building, many saw Elyon as the next evolution of what made Terra memorable. The aesthetic was rich with detail, floating cities, intricate machinery, and fantasy-touch steam tech that merged magic with invention. It wasn't just style, it was a world that beckoned to be explored. And for a time, the vision truly resonated. The trailers were mesmerizing. Concept art hinted at vast possibilities. Gameplay previews teased massive siege warfare both in the skies and on the ground, with players donning jetpacks or piloting aerial behemoths. The excitement wasn't just hype. It was built on the genuine potential Elyon offered to reshape how we saw the MMORPG genre. In those early days, Elyon felt like more than just a game in development. It was a dream in motion, an invitation to fly. The transformation from Ascent, Infinite Realm to Elyon wasn't just a name change, it was a shift in identity, philosophy, and ultimately, ambition. When Bluehole Studio rebranded the project as Elyon, it marked a turning point that would define the game's legacy just as much as its mechanics. What was once a skybound steampunk fantasy focused on airship combat and verticality slowly grounded itself, shedding its wings for something more conventional, more accessible, but also for many less magical. The decision to pivot came quietly but decisively. During development, Bluehole began to scale back the core emphasis on aerial warfare, citing design complexities, balancing issues, and a desire to refocus the gameplay around a more grounded, fast-paced combat system. The once celebrated promise of customizable airships, strategic aerial battlegrounds, and Sky City sieges gave way to a more traditional MMO format. Instead of soaring through clouds, players were now navigating dense terrain with flashy spells and high-speed melee. The skies, once filled with possibility, became more of a backdrop than a battlefield. With that shift, the name Elyon was introduced, named after a portal of divine energy within the game's lore, symbolizing power and conflict between rival factions. While the new title fit the revised lore, many fans saw the rebranding as a signal that something essential had been lost. The soul of the game, the thing that set it apart from the pack, had been trimmed down, streamlined, and restructured into something more familiar. Reactions from the community were understandably mixed. Some welcomed the new direction, intrigued by the tight, action-based ground combat and the promise of polished class systems. But others felt betrayed, mourning the loss of the airborne sandbox that had first captured their imaginations. Forums filled with concern, longtime supporters voiced frustration, feeling as though the game they had been following had been quietly reshaped into something safer, less daring. The transition to Elyon didn't just change the game's mechanics, it changed its spirit. What was once a vision of fantasy wrapped in brass and steam was now a fast-paced, landlocked war between factions. Whether that pivot was necessary or not remains a subject of debate, But one thing became clear. The journey from Ascent, Infinite Realm to Elyon would always carry the weight of what might have been. Elyon was a game that burned bright, then burned out. For all its potential, it struggled to hold the momentum it needed to thrive in the fiercely competitive MMO space. Its decline wasn't caused by one single failure, but rather a cascade of missteps that chipped away at its player base and slowly dissolved the faith many once had in its ambitious vision. One of the earliest and most persistent issues was performance. While Elyon aimed to deliver fast-paced, action-heavy combat, its optimization never quite kept up. Even on high-end systems, players reported frame drops during large-scale battles, UI stuttering, and unpredictable latency. The very gameplay that was meant to feel fluid and reactive sometimes felt janky or unresponsive in real-time PvP. Server stability also became a point of contention. Disconnects during key battles, unpredictable maintenance schedules, and region-specific lag created barriers to entry for both casual and hardcore players alike. But the technical hiccups alone weren't the game's undoing. Many pointed toward the monetization system as the real nail in the coffin. While the core game was accessible, a growing number of systems, gear enhancements, stat boosts, crafting perks, became closely tied to real money purchases. To many, Elyon began to flirt too closely with pay-to-win territory. Cosmetic microtransactions were expected, but when gameplay-affecting advantages entered the store, it soured the competitive environment and discouraged players who didn't want to spend beyond the initial time investment. And then came the timing, arguably the worst possible. Elyon launched in the shadow of Lost Ark, a juggernaut that brought with it polished systems, expansive world building, and a player base ready to invest thousands of hours. Where Lost Ark dazzled with refined visuals, addictive dungeon loops, and a deeply layered endgame, Elyon felt rushed in comparison. For many, the decision was easy. Why stick with a game that was still struggling to find itself when another offered a smoother ride with more generous rewards? By mid-2022, cracks were showing, regional servers began to thin, content updates slowed, the community began to shrink, not with fury, but with silence. The passionate discussions gave way to empty forums, matchmaking queues grew longer, and major streamers who once hyped the game quietly moved on. In late 2022, the Korean servers, once considered the game's stronghold, shut down. By 2023, the global servers followed. The game had officially been sunset, leaving behind only screenshots, videos, and memories of what once felt like the next big thing. Elyon's fall wasn't sudden. It was a slow, inevitable unraveling, a mix of unrealized potential, unfortunate timing, technical woes, and monetization choices turned a promising title into a cautionary tale. A lesson in what happens when a game loses sight of what made it exciting in the first place, and when the genre around it refuses to slow down. If there's one thing that Elyon undeniably got right, it was the feel of its combat. From the very first clash of blades to the thundering echo of an ultimate ability landing mid-arena, Elyon delivered action-oriented gameplay that felt visceral, quick, and alive. Unlike tab-target MMOs of old, this was a game where your reflexes mattered. You weren't just clicking abilities, you were dodging, aiming, weaving movement into every rotation like it was second nature. It was fluid, fast-paced, and, at its best, ferociously fun. What set Elyon apart in particular was the sheer flexibility baked into its class system. At launch, players could choose from 6 primary classes: Slayer, Warlord, Elementalist, Mystic, Gunner, and Assassin, with more introduced over time. Each class had a distinct personality and rhythm, whether it was the gun-slinging chaos of the Gunner or the spell-charged elegance of the Elementalist. But it wasn't just about picking a class, it was about shaping how that class played. The game featured a skill customization system that allowed players to modify and evolve their abilities through runes, traits, and branching upgrades. One player's Mystic might focus on wide area healing and shields, while another might lean into mobility and crowd control. The diversity was not just for show. it directly impacted how players approach PvE and PvP content. And then there was the Mana Awakening system, a deeper layer of progression that offered permanent enhancements and build-defining choices. This wasn't your standard increase crit chance by 2% type of passive tree. It allowed for meaningful tweaks to class identity, often unlocking new ways to play entirely. Some upgrades would enhance specific combos or elemental types, while others altered how damage scaled or how cooldowns were refunded. Combined with gear bonuses and player-chosen glyphs, the result was a system that gave you ownership over your character's potential. You weren't just leveling, you were evolving. Even small mechanics added flavor. Dodge mechanics, parry windows, combo chaining, aerial skills, and break mechanics all added layers of tactical depth. It wasn't enough to just deal damage. You had to do it well, smartly, with purpose. Ultimately, this was where Elyon felt like a cut above, where it whispered the promise of something greater. It invited experimentation, it rewarded mastery, and it offered freedom. And even now, long after its sunset, players who tasted that combat still remember how good it felt to play. It's rare in MMORPGs to feel so in control, so actively engaged. That sensation, that moment-to-moment gameplay, it was Elyon's soul. The world of Elyon was nothing if not ambitious, an intricate tapestry of steampunk machinery, magical currents, and high-stakes conflict woven across floating continents and fractured skies. From the moment you stepped foot into its universe, it was clear that this wasn't your typical fantasy MMO. Gone were the dragons and elves of tradition. Instead, Elyon introduced a world powered by arcane engines, gear-driven cities, and portals swirling with raw mana. It was a world at war, not just in battles, but in ideologies, invention, and destiny. At the heart of its narrative stood the two rival factions, Vulpin and Antari. These weren't just red and blue flags slapped onto player names. They were nations built on diverging worldviews. The Vulpin represented tradition, structure, and a belief in stability through governance and magic. The Antari, by contrast, thrived on freedom, innovation, and pushing the limits of technology and power. Their war was more than territorial. It was philosophical, a clash over how Elyon's power should be wielded. The faction war provided not only the justification for large-scale PvP, but also a thematic backbone for nearly every system in the game, from quest lines to world events. The setting itself was a bold fusion of aesthetics. Towering, steam-powered fortresses coexisted with ancient ruins pulsing with forgotten spells. Sky islands hung above the clouds like watchful sentinels, connected by gliders, portals, and floating platforms. Magical reactors pulsed at the heart of capital cities, while massive war machines rumbled across broken landscapes. In every corner of Elyon, there was an undercurrent of wonder and sometimes menace beneath the hum of machines and the glow of mana veins. Narratively, Elyon offered depth, if you went looking for it. Lore was embedded into zones, quest dialogue, codex entries, and environmental design. There were ancient beings, forbidden technologies, and the ever-present tension of a world teetering on the brink of transcendence or collapse. But despite the richness of the setting, the game often struggled to deliver its story with the weight it deserved. Key plot lines were sometimes buried in fragmented side quests, and major characters lacked the gravitas or screen time to truly resonate. The world looked like it had stories to tell, but too often those stories were whispered rather than declared. Still, when it worked, Elyon's world was captivating. It dared to ask questions other MMOs didn't. What happens when magic becomes technology? What kind of societies emerge in a sky fractured by power? What are we willing to sacrifice to seize control of a realm like Elyon? The potential was there, striking and sincere, and for those who paid attention, the world building was more than just background. It was a compelling, if underutilized, invitation to dream. In its heyday, Elyon set its sights on delivering a rich, dual-pronged experience, one that would thrill both the competitive spirit and the cooperative soul. It promised large-scale PvP wars alongside deep PvE dungeons, hoping to strike that elusive balance that only the best MMORPGs achieve. And while the ambition was there, the results were a tale of two worlds, one brimming with potential, the other haunted by uneven execution. On the PvP side, Elyon leaned heavily into faction warfare. The realm versus realm system placed players in the heart of the conflict between Vulpin and Onteri, pitting them against each other in massive open-world skirmishes and instanced battles where control points, strategy, and sheer chaos defined victory. These battles were frenetic and grand, full of explosive spells and steel, with siege engines, gliders, and aerial bombardments turning each match into a spectacular display. For a time, it truly felt like you were part of something bigger, a soldier in a war, not just another player in a queue. In addition to RVR, Elyon offered more intimate PvP in the form of structured arenas. Here, combat was distilled down to its purest form, skill against skill. These modes highlighted the depth of the combat system, where dodges, interrupts, and burst windows determined outcomes. It was here that the precision of the action-oriented mechanics really shined, and competitive players found their proving ground. PvE, meanwhile, was a mixed bag. The game featured traditional dungeons with boss mechanics, loot tables, and role-based teamwork. Some of these encounters were genuinely engaging, featuring layered fights and environment-based challenges. World events and dynamic zone content gave the PvE experience a pulse outside of dungeons, with massive creatures descending from the sky or rupturing through the terrain to wreak havoc. These encounters pulled players together, reminding them that Elyon's world was alive and dangerous. However, the PvE loop eventually began to show signs of repetition. Many players felt that dungeons lacked variety over time, and some events became more about grinding efficiency than immersion or narrative depth. Without consistent updates or bold new PvE content, players who preferred cooperative play started to drift. Worse, progression systems like gear upgrades and resource farming often funneled players into specific activities repeatedly, which made the experience feel more mechanical than magical. Balance was another recurring issue. Player versus player often felt more rewarding, both in terms of progression and community energy. This tilted the ecosystem heavily toward competitive content, leaving PvE players feeling somewhat neglected. The PvP crowd stayed longer, but even they began to feel the sting of diminishing rewards and slow balancing updates, especially when class disparities or overpowered builds went unaddressed for too long. In the end, Elyon's content strategy had both strength and fragility. When it worked, it soared. When it faltered, the weight of its ambitions became too heavy to carry. And yet, for those who were there in the early days, charging across the skies with friends, holding choke points in heated battles, or downing a boss seconds before a wipe, it offered moments of pure, undeniable magic. Moments that reminded us why we chase games like this in the first place. At the heart of Elyon was a community that, at least in the beginning, genuinely believed. It was a diverse player base, veterans from Terra, curious wanderers from other MMOs, and PvP enthusiasts hungry for a new battlefield. What united them wasn't just hype, it was hope. Hope that Elyon would become a bold, long-lasting home in a genre that often promises more than it delivers, and for a brief moment, it almost was. In the early weeks, the community felt alive. Global chats buzzed with class theories, dungeon tips, and factional pride. Players were eager to test the boundaries of the game's build systems and dive headfirst into realm versus realm battles. Guilds flourished, organizing dungeon runs, dominating PvP maps, and even hosting their own community-driven events. The energy was electric. Players were optimistic, enthusiastic, and willing to invest in the game's future, even when some cracks began to show. But that spark was hard to sustain. As design choices grew more divisive, the community began to fragment. The gear upgrade system, for example, created a noticeable divide between casual and hardcore players, especially when RNG failures and monetization options made progression feel less like a grind and more like a gamble. Discussions that once celebrated discovery turned into debates about fairness and fatigue. Some players began to express frustration at class imbalances or uneven patch cycles. Others felt unheard, especially when community feedback about PvE droughts or PvP exploits went unanswered for long stretches. Still, Elyon did make efforts to support its player base. Community events, seasonal festivals, login bonuses, and time-limited challenges tried to keep the pulse going. Some were well received, drawing players back in for costumes, mounts, or powerful gear. But without a stable, long-term content roadmap or meaningful interaction from the developers, these bursts of excitement were often short-lived. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Elyon's journey was watching such a passionate community begin to quietly vanish. Many players didn't leave in anger, they left in silence. A server that once echoed with faction chants and global cheers slowly faded into stillness. Discords became ghost towns, streamers moved on, and the game that once brought people together simply stopped giving them reasons to stay. And yet even now, you'll find players who speak of Elyon with fondness, not because it lived up to every expectation, but because it tried, because for a little while, they believed in it. They found a guild that felt like family. They fought in a battle that meant something. They crafted, they quested, they laughed in voice chat. The experience was imperfect, but it was real. And sometimes, in the world of MMOs, that's what lingers the longest. Elyon began as a dream called Ascent, Infinite Realm, a bold and imaginative leap into a skybound future where magic clashed with machines and airships roared across fragmented heavens. Its original vision was nothing short of breathtaking, a steampunk fantasy where players soared, battled, and explored in a living world shaped by their choices. But as that vision evolved, becoming more grounded, more familiar, the journey became less about flight and more about survival. And in the end, Elyon became a different kind of lesson altogether. The transformation from AIR to Elyon was paved with compromise. Creative pivots, gameplay shifts, technical reworks, and market realities all played a role in reshaping what the game ultimately became. The heart of the original concept, the aerial combat, the sweeping exploration, the mechanical wonder, was slowly scaled back to fit a more conventional model. In some ways, this was necessary. In others, it cost Elyon the very thing that made it unforgettable. Its downfall wasn't the result of a single flaw, but rather the accumulation of many. Performance issues eroded first impressions. Monetization systems alienated fair play advocates. Lack of consistent PvE content wore down explorers and dungeon runners. And the arrival of fierce competition like Lost Ark exposed just how fragile Elyon's footing truly was. But perhaps the deepest cut came from the loss of direction. When a game built on boldness begins to play it safe, it becomes harder for players to believe in it. And yet Elyon wasn't a failure in the truest sense. It created memories, it brought people together, it introduced systems that were genuinely enjoyable, combat that felt good, class customization that empowered creativity, and moments where players felt like they were part of something grand. For a time, it offered something beautiful, even if it couldn't hold it forever. The broader lesson for MMORPG developers is clear. Vision matters, innovation matters, but execution, clarity, and community trust matter just as much. Players today are more informed, more connected, and more discerning. They want to feel respected, they want to be heard, and above all, they want to believe in the world they're stepping into. In the story of MMO history, Elyon will not be remembered as the titan that changed everything, but it will be remembered as the game that dared to try. A bold experiment with sky-high ambition that stumbled, rebranded, fought to find its footing, and eventually faded. And while its time was short, its journey left behind lessons that future worlds may one day learn from. Because somewhere in the clouds it once promised, Elyon showed us what it looks like to aim for the heavens, even if the landing was never quite smooth.